The year was 1865. The Union Army that was based out of Virginia had grown to over 122,000 men, while the Confederate Army that was based out of Northern Virginia only had 60,000 soldiers. On April 4th, 1865, the Confederate Army was gathered around a small little town known as Amelia Courthouse. The Union Army was closing in on the town from the east and the south. This was the beginning of the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse.
The Confederate Army was led by Robert E. Lee.
The Union Army was led by Ulysses S. Grant.
April 5th, Lee started his troops marching southwest.
Little did the Confederates know that Grant had guessed exactly what they were doing. Grant started his troops marching as well. Grant had many cavalry corps leading his army. The cavalry made some very steady, hard attacks on the front of the Confederate army.
After these few attacks were over, Lee realized how hungry his soldiers were. He sent his soldiers to Farmville in hopes that the trains passing through would bring them a supply of food. A few days later, when the troops reached Farmville, they were overjoyed to find food. But little did they know the Union forces were still right on their heels. Unfortunately, while they were in the small town, part of Lee's army became separated and the Union started attacking them. Over 6,000 of the Confederate soldiers were captured and 2,000 more were also captured. After this horrific attack, Grant and his soldiers set up their headquarters in a local hotel room.
Grant talked with one of his generals about how he urged that Lee's army should surrender. He wrote this message out as a historic message.
General Lee, the results of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Sincerely, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant gave this message to one of his staff members to carry to the Confederate Army's headquarters. When they were walking towards the Confederates, they were carrying a white flag. The white flag was a sign that meant truce, and the soldier carrying the flag could not be shot at. They just wanted to have a peaceful meeting. Unfortunately for the soldier carrying the white flag, he was shot at by a member of Lee's army that thought he was pulling some trick on their army. Finally, the message was handed from Grant's staff member to a member of Lee's army, directing that it should be handed to Lee.
No, not yet. I am not ready to surrender yet. Although he wasn't ready to surrender, he wanted to find out what terms the Union Army was willing to give him, because they were known for not giving very good terms. Lee received a letter from Grant that stated the terms. They were much better than what he expected, but he was still not ready to surrender. Suddenly, a few hours after Lee received the letter on the terms given by Grant, a member of the Union Army made a surprise attack on the western part of Lee's army. They managed to capture hundreds of his soldiers. There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant. I'd rather not surrender, but this is what I have to do.
3 a.m. the next morning, Lee got on his horse and rode toward the Union Army. On his way to Grant, he ran into one of Grant's soldiers who had a note for him. The note stated that Grant would like to meet him to discuss the surrender. The nearest town to them was Appomattox Courthouse. There, two commanders decided to find a meeting place in this town because it was so convenient. The meeting place they decided on was the house of McLean. It was a large 2-story brick building.
Grant and Lee both entered the house, they greeted each other, and then started their long meeting.
I suppose, General Grant, that the objective of our meeting is fully understood. I asked you to ascertain upon what terms you would receive the surrender of my army.
Yes, sir. The terms are the same as I wrote out on the letter to you. They have not changed.
I don't completely agree with those terms. I believe that the belongings of my soldiers should not be taken away.
I'm sorry, sir. I believe it would be fine if your soldiers kept their horses and other belongings. They will need those supplies for planting and growing their crops anyway. Officer, make a copy of these terms in ink.
The document stated the terms that were given to Lee's army. Both Lee and Grant signed the papers, and by about 3:45 the surrender was over. As Lee rode away on his horse, soldiers crowded around him and saluted him. The surrender had been made. All of the Union soldiers celebrated and flung themselves about. The war was over.
After the surrender and the end of the war, there needed to be a ceremony. The ceremony occurred on April 12th. The Union soldiers all lined up and watched as the Confederate soldiers left. They got rid of all their weapons and burned their flags because they were no longer soldiers.